Good evening, everyone. Tonight we walk quietly together into the breath of a new night, cool air brushing against the curtains, shadows gently shifting across the walls, a distant hum of life softening into stillness. Maybe you've just put down your phone, turned off the lights, or settled into your favorite blanket. But even now, as your body begins to rest, your mind may still be holding the weight of the day, or the year, or a life that has asked you to carry far more than it offered in return. And so, let's begin with something simple and a little daring. What if I told you that most people never truly meet themselves? Not once. They spend a lifetime answering to names, routines, habits, but never come face to face with the quiet being underneath it all. That's the bold truth. And tonight we begin the gentle work of remembering that hidden self. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling present with us tonight, I'd love to know your location and the local time. Leave a comment and let me know who you are and where you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a gentle hum, and let's begin our journey together tonight. There is a line Rumi once whispered across centuries: "The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you, don't go back to sleep." Many hear it and imagine the soft quiet before sunrise, the sacred silence just before the birds begin. But Rumi was not only speaking of the hour on the clock, he was pointing to something deeper, those rare moments in life when something stirs inside you, when the veil thins and you feel, even if just for a breath, that you are meant for more than bills, errands, and roles played on autopilot. These moments can come without warning. A conversation that lingers longer than expected, a piece of music that cracks open your chest, a loss that doesn't ask for your permission, or sometimes something softer, like the way a certain light hits your old kitchen counter and makes you feel like you're living in a memory not quite your own. Most people miss these moments, not because they don't matter, but because they return too quickly to the sleep of routine, the comfort of forgetting. It's easier that way, safer, perhaps. Familiarity, even when dull, has a way of making us feel secure. But if you are here tonight, if your soul feels even a little restless, then maybe, just maybe, you haven't entirely forgotten. Buddhism speaks often of vigilance, not in the tense, militaristic sense, but in the quiet, watchful awareness of a monk who sweeps fallen leaves, not to clean the ground, but to remain awake, to be present. The Buddha once said, "Be mindful, be watchful, aware among the unaware, awake while others dream." This is not a call to superiority, it's a call to remembering, to not fall back asleep when the soul stirs awake. In Zen tradition, there is an old story about a student who asked his master, "How can I wake up?" The master said nothing. He only stood, poured tea into the student's cup until it overflowed, spilling onto the table and floor. The student gasped. "Why did you do that?" The master smiled. "Your mind is already full. There is no room for awakening. Empty yourself." Rumi too speaks of this overflowing cup, the mind so full of roles and worries that it cannot hold even a single drop of the dawn breeze's secret. So he says, "Stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion." And in that one sentence, he does not flatter us. He shatters us. For if it is true, if we are indeed the universe in motion, then why do we live as shadows of ourselves? The Buddhist path echoes this inquiry. It does not deny the pain of existence. It teaches us to sit with it, to watch it arise and fall like clouds across the moon. To live awake means to see suffering not as a mistake, but as part of the pattern woven into the very shape of awakening. All conditioned things are impermanent. The Buddha reminded us, work out your own salvation with diligence. This is where Rumi and the Dharma bow to each other. Both understand that awakening does not arrive wrapped in comfort. It often begins with restlessness, that soft ache in the chest, the quiet sense that something is missing, the longing that cannot be named. And maybe you feel that tonight, maybe your restlessness is not a problem to fix, but a doorway to enter. Maybe it's not a sign that something is wrong, but that something is right, that your soul is knocking, hoping you'll put down the day's weight long enough to hear it. In this way, longing is not the opposite of peace. It is the beginning of peace, the thread that pulls you back to something sacred. A debated idea in many spiritual traditions is whether this longing comes from within or from something greater, an external divine force. Rumi offers a radical third way. What you seek is seeking you. In other words, there is no inner or outer. There is only the shared heartbeat between you and the beloved. The longing you feel is the echo of being longed for. And so tonight, let us not run from our restlessness. Let us listen to it. Let it speak. Let it guide. For within it may be the breeze at dawn, the one with secrets, the one that Rumi begged us not to sleep through. Now I invite you to take a deep breath. Inhale gently and exhale slowly. Feel the subtle tension begin to melt from your shoulders. Let the silence between these words be part of the teaching. Let the rhythm of your own breath remind you, you are here, you are present, you are not asleep. And now, a question to carry with you into the night. When was the last time your heart stirred? Not in fear, not in duty, but in longing. And did you listen or fall back asleep? Let that question rest beside you. We will return to it. But first, let us continue onward into the flame that longing becomes. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. There are certain phrases that do not merely echo in the mind. They lodge themselves in the soul and begin to rearrange everything. Rumi's words, "You are the universe in ecstatic motion," are like that. They do not whisper, they resound. They do not decorate, they dismantle. For a listener who is truly present, they become more than metaphor. They become a mirror, one that refuses to show you your fears or your failures, but instead reflects your vastness. And if you sit with them long enough, those words start to feel less like poetry and more like memory, something you have always known but forgot along the way. This is not the small, self-assured memory of facts and dates. This is a deeper remembering, the kind that comes not from the brain, but from the heart's original silence. It is what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, where everything is seen as if for the first time, untouched by layers of judgment or history. And in that pure seeing, the self is no longer a name or a face. It is a flame, a current, a motion, not separate from the universe but identical to it. The Buddha once reminded his disciples that the self is not a fixed thing. It is not a noun but a verb, a process, a stream. Just as a candle's flame is not the same from moment to moment, yet still appears continuous, so too is the self. In that truth lies great liberation, but also great resistance. Because what are we, if not our stories, our habits, our cherished identities worn like old coats? And yet suffering often grows from the soil of such clinging. We suffer not because we are too vast, but because we believe ourselves too small. We shrink into labels, into roles, into patterns that fit safely within the world's expectations. But something inside aches, not loudly, just enough to remind us that we were not made to live inside tight spaces, not spiritually, not emotionally, not existentially. Rumi saw this clearly. Stop acting so small, he pleads. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. This ecstatic motion is not about euphoria or excess. It's about the wild, undomesticated beauty of being fully alive, of recognizing that you are not a separate observer of the cosmos, but its living, breathing embodiment. Every breath you take is a continuation of the Big Bang. Every step, a ripple in the great unfolding. In the Buddhist teachings, this perspective is known as interbeing. Coined by the Zen master Thich Nhat, he speaks to the truth that nothing exists independently. Not a flower, not a cloud, not you or me. Everything exists because of everything else. You are made of sunshine, of rain, of ancestors, of stories told and stories forgotten. You are not outside the universe. You are its song. But the ego resists this truth. It prefers separateness. It prefers edges, categories, comparison. The ego does not like being dissolved into stars or river currents. It wants to stand out, to be praised, to control. So when it hears Rumi's words, it either scoffs or it appropriates them, turning poetry into performance. But the soul knows better. The soul remembers. There is an ancient parable from the Buddhist tradition. A man walks through the desert, parched with thirst. He stumbles upon a well, but when he peers in, he sees only the reflection of the sky. He assumes it is empty and walks on. He dies within sight of the very water that could have saved him. The story, though simple, speaks volumes. How often do we dismiss the divine within us because we see only the surface? How often do we die spiritually, surrounded by the sacred, because we assume it is not meant for us? This is not just a spiritual question, it is a deeply human one. The philosophical world has long debated the tension between human finitude and cosmic belonging. Some argue that we are just a speck, a brief flicker in a vast, indifferent universe. Others insist on our centrality, our divine purpose. But Rumi offers a vision that dissolves this polarity. You are both and neither. You are the speck and the whole sky, the whisper and the thunder. You are not simply in the universe. You are the universe, expressing itself in a form it has never worn before. And this matters. It matters because if you believe you are small, you will make small choices. You will speak with hesitation. You will settle for half love, half truth, half aliveness. But if you remember what Rumi is telling you, then every morning becomes sacred. Every interaction becomes prayer. You begin to live not to escape life, but to embody it fully, wildly, beautifully. The Zen way teaches us to sit with what is, not to seek enlightenment as a trophy, but to live each moment as if it were the whole path. A bowl of rice, a sweeping of leaves, a sip of tea, all sacred, not because of what they are, but because of how they are met. In this too, you are the ecstatic motion of the universe, not when you perform, but when you fully receive the present moment. So tonight, as you lie in the quiet warmth of your bed, consider what it would mean to live without shrinking. What it would feel like to stop apologizing for your existence, to speak as one who belongs, to move as one who remembers, not because you've been given permission, but because it is your birthright. And if your mind begins to doubt, to ask, who am I to carry the universe within me? Pause and ask instead, who am I not to? Now let your breath return to its natural rhythm. Let the day's noise soften into background silence. Inhale through the nose. Feel the rise of your chest and exhale gently through parted lips. There is no rush here, no need to become anything. Just rest in what you already are. And I leave you with this question for tonight's quiet hours. If you no longer believed you were small, how would your life begin to move? When you're ready, we'll continue. The ache you carry may be the flame beginning to rise. The ache that becomes the flame. There are aches that fade with time, fatigue after a long day, the soft soreness of old injuries, the dull heaviness of a passing sorrow. And then there is another kind of ache, one that does not vanish but deepens. It sits quietly behind your ribs, not loud enough to scream, but persistent enough that you cannot forget it. It lingers in the silence after conversation, in the hush between your tasks, in the space where nothing is wrong, but something is missing. Rumi knew this ache intimately. Long before the world knew him as a mystic or poet, he was simply Jalal al-Din, a scholar, a man of faith and structure, wrapped in the garments of tradition. He lectured, he debated, he taught. But beneath all that structure was a quiet thirst, a longing that no scripture or sermon could fully quench. His life, though rich in knowledge, lacked the raw intimacy of direct experience. And then came Shams of Tabriz. The moment Rumi met Shams was not a moment of comfort. It was a moment of burning. Shams was wild, unpredictable, and utterly uninterested in Rumi's scholarly identity. He didn't want recitations. He wanted fire. He wanted the soul, stripped bare of its credentials. And in that meeting, Rumi's ache found its spark. In Zen tradition, there is a saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But what is rarely said is that the true teacher does not soothe. The true teacher disrupts. They arrive like a stone cast into still water, sending ripples through every illusion you've mistaken for truth. The Buddha's own path to awakening began not with comfort, but with exposure to suffering, old age, illness, death. And from that exposure, something awakened, an ache that refused to go back to sleep. This ache is not a flaw, it is the soul's compass. In Buddhist philosophy, it's closely related to dukkha, the first noble truth, the pervasive sense that something in this life is unsatisfactory. But unlike the kind of pain that begs to be numbed, this ache is sacred. It is the friction of your soul rubbing against the edges of a life too small for it. It is the signal that your current existence, though perhaps successful or orderly, does not reach the depth your heart remembers. Rumi's meeting with Shams was not just the story of a friendship. It was the story of rupture, of being split open so deeply that there was no return to the man he was before. He would later write, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And it was in this wound, this ache, that Rumi's transformation began. His words became less about theology and more about longing, less about knowledge and more about love. And not the romantic kind of love that comes and goes, but a divine intoxication, a burning that refused to be extinguished. The debate among mystics, philosophers, and seekers has long centered around the role of suffering in awakening. Some argue that transformation comes through joy, through serenity, through gentle practice. Others insist that only the fire of heartbreak or loss can shatter the ego's defenses. But perhaps the truth lies not in either extreme, but in how we meet the ache itself. Whether we run from it, suppress it, distract ourselves endlessly, or whether we turn toward it with reverence. There is a Zen story of a monk who asked his teacher, "How do I find enlightenment?" The master replied, "Have you finished grieving yet?" The monk, puzzled, asked, "Grieving what?" And the teacher said, "Everything you are not." This is the heart of the fire, grieving the layers we must shed to return to who we really are. When Rumi was cracked open by longing, he did not retreat into silence or despair. He began to whirl. Literally, his longing became movement. The ache became a dance. His poetry was not written from safety. It was drawn from the raw edge of devotion, where longing and union blur into one. And so his words do not console the surface of your life. They reach straight into the furnace at your core. The Buddhist path, too, invites us to stay with the fire. As fire refines gold, the Dhammapada tells us, so does suffering refine the heart. Not because pain is inherently noble, but because when met with awareness, it becomes purification. The ache, when honored, becomes the flame that burns away illusion, false identity and fear. What remains is not ash, but clarity. As you lie here tonight, perhaps something within you aches, not because something is broken, but because something deeper is waking up. A memory, maybe, not of a specific place or person, but of wholeness. You may not be able to name it, but you feel its pull, and that pull is sacred. It is the same longing that stirred in Rumi, that drew Siddhartha from the palace, that has tugged at the edges of countless seekers for thousands of years. You are not alone in this. This fire has danced in many hearts, and while the forms of longing may differ, the source is one. The ache is not the problem, it is the invitation. So if tonight you find yourself restless, uncertain, even quietly aching, do not push it away. Stay close. Let it warm you. Let it soften what has become rigid. Let it lead you inward, toward something not yet fully known, but deeply familiar. And if you need a reminder, let it be this: you are not too sensitive, you are not too much, you are simply beginning to feel the flame. Now breathe deeply once more. Let your body sink into stillness, while your heart remains awake. With every inhale, welcome the ache, without resistance. With every exhale, release the story you've told yourself about what that ache means. And as the silence gathers around you like a soft cloak, I leave you with a question to rest alongside your breath. What if the ache you carry is not something to fix, but the beginning of your becoming? When you're ready, we'll follow that flame even deeper, toward the place where what you seek has already begun to seek you. What you seek is seeking you. Some truths arrive like thunder, loud, jarring, impossible to ignore. Others arrive like dew, quiet, soft, and yet utterly transformative if you pause long enough to feel them settle. Rumi's declaration, "What you seek is seeking you," belongs to the second kind. It doesn't shout its meaning. It waits, patiently. Like the sound of a distant bell on a foggy morning, it calls you inward, not to chase after answers, but to soften into presence. At first it seems like a comforting idea, that your deepest longings are not wasted echoes in an indifferent universe, but are in fact calls and responses, two sides of the same sacred conversation. But as with all great truths, the comfort is only the beginning. The real gift lies in what it asks of you, to trust that your longing is not weakness, and to believe, even in the quiet, that what you yearn for yearns for you too. In Buddhist thought, there is a powerful teaching about this invisible thread, pratyasa, the law of dependent origination. Nothing arises independently. Everything is linked, like pearls on a string. Every thought, every action, every heartbeat is part of a web that connects all things. You are not isolated in your longing. That longing is part of the universe moving toward itself. And yet we often live as though we are chasing something just beyond reach. We imagine that love, peace, meaning, or awakening are distant destinations, waiting in the hands of another person, or hiding on the far side of a future day. This endless pursuit creates a quiet despair, a sense that we are always behind, never enough, always lacking. But what if we have been running not forward, but away from the still point, where the seeking and the sought are already touching? Zen offers a parable that reveals this dynamic with clarity. A man is running wildly through a forest, certain that he is being chased by a monster. He runs until he collapses in exhaustion, but when he finally turns to face what was behind him, he sees nothing, only the sound of his own footsteps echoing back. The monster was his own shadow. The thing he feared was not outside of him. It was the distance between himself and the present moment. Rumi's insight cuts into this illusion. What you seek is seeking you, not will seek you, not might seek you. it already is. The separation you feel is not a cosmic truth. It is a perceptual fog, and fog, while thick and disorienting, is not solid. It lifts with warmth, with presence, with the gentle heat of awareness. This is where Buddhist mindfulness becomes more than a practice. It becomes a remembering. When you return to your breath, not mechanically, but intimately, you begin to feel it again. The presence that was always with you. You begin to see that the longing you carry is not a flaw in your design, but the imprint of something sacred, calling you home. But what about the suffering? What about the loneliness, the confusion, the empty spaces that seem to contradict this truth? This is where many philosophies part ways. Some spiritual traditions teach detachment as a means to avoid pain. Others promise that devotion will erase difficulty. But the Dharma and Rumi walk a different path. They invite you to turn toward the ache and to see that even in the hollow places, something luminous is reaching for you. In the Heart Sutra, one of the most revered texts in Mahayana Buddhism, we read, "Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form." This paradox is not a riddle, it is an invitation. Emptiness is not absence, it is space, and space is where connection becomes possible. Your longing, then, is not proof that something is missing. It is the space being made for what is coming. Rumi wrote, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you, not knowing how blind that was." Lovers don't finally meet somewhere. They're in each other all along. This is more than romance. It is the mystical realization that the division we feel between ourselves and truth, between ourselves and love, is the illusion. The beloved in all its forms, truth, God, purpose, peace, has never been outside of us. It has only been waiting for the door of perception to open. Philosophers often debate whether the universe is personal or impersonal, whether it responds to us or remains indifferent. But perhaps the real question is not about the nature of the universe, but about our ability to listen, to notice the quiet ways it speaks, not in shouts or signs, but in longing itself. When a flower turns toward the sun, is it not also true that the sun shines toward the flower? When you take one honest step toward what is real, something steps toward you, not always visibly, not always quickly, but always inevitably. The universe is not cruel, it is patient. As you lie here tonight, perhaps you've grown tired of searching. Perhaps your heart feels heavy from asking questions that seem to have no reply. But what if the very ache in your heart is not a question, but an answer? What if it is the sign that the thing you seek is already moving toward you, just as you are moving toward it? Now, as you breathe gently in this space, notice the stillness around you. Notice the way your body is held by the bed beneath you, supported without effort. Notice how the air comes in and out, without needing permission. This is how it has always been. You are already part of the sacred exchange, already included, already enough. And so let yourself rest, not as one waiting to be found, but as one already seen. And I leave you with this question, to settle beside your breath in the quiet hours ahead. If what you seek is truly seeking you, can you be still long enough to let it find you? When you're ready, we'll continue into the changing seasons of your heart and the deeper rhythms waiting beneath. The seasons of the heart. The heart is not a fixed thing. It does not remain in a single state, nor does it follow a predictable rhythm. Some days it swells with warmth, gratitude, and quiet joy. Other days it feels like an empty chamber, echoing with questions that have no name. To live with a heart means to live with change, and yet so often we resist this movement. We treat our inner world as if it should be stable, controllable, neatly arranged. But the truth is far gentler and far more wild. The heart, like the earth, moves in seasons. Rumi knew this. He wrote, "Try to accept the changing seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons passing over your fields." He wasn't offering a poetic suggestion. He was offering a spiritual discipline. For to accept the inner seasons, truly accept them, is to step out of the cycle of self-judgment and into the flow of reality itself. In Buddhist philosophy, this acceptance aligns closely with the principle of anicca, the impermanence of all things. Nothing in existence is static. Emotions, thoughts, identities, circumstances, they arise, change, and pass. To cling to any one of them as permanent is to invite suffering. The Buddha taught this not as pessimism, but as liberation. If everything changes, then pain is not forever, nor is confusion, fear, or even despair. The weather of the soul will shift, but knowing this and living it are different things. Often when the heart feels heavy, we believe something has gone wrong. We look at the joy we once felt and wonder where it went, or what we did to lose it. We panic when peace disappears, thinking we've failed. But the field does not mourn when the flowers vanish in winter. It does not curse the snow. It simply rests, trusting the return of warmth in its time. The wise heart does the same. There is a Zen story of a monk who tended a small garden behind the monastery. Each morning, he would remove the dead leaves that had fallen during the night. One morning, his teacher came by and asked what he was doing. "I am keeping the garden clean," the monk replied. The master gently said, "Let a few leaves stay. It is autumn, after all." That story, in its simplicity, holds a deep truth. We do not have to keep everything bright and blooming. Some days are meant for stillness. Some emotions, though uncomfortable, are part of the sacred rhythm. Sadness, too, has its place. So does grief. So does uncertainty. These are not signs of failure, but indicators of change. And change is the very heartbeat of life. Philosophers and psychologists have often debated the nature of emotional well-being. Is it the consistent presence of joy? Is it balance? Is it control over emotion? But perhaps real well-being is less about control and more about intimacy with our own inner world. To know your heart so deeply that when it grows quiet, you don't rush to fix it. You sit beside it. You listen. You offer warmth. Rumi understood this kind of intimacy. He did not write only from light. He wrote through longing, through fire, through the cold winters of his soul. And still, he trusted the cycle. "Don't get lost in your pain," he said. "Know that one day your pain will become your cure." To Rumi, every emotion was a guest. Every season had its reason. Joy was not better than sorrow, only different. This mirrors the Buddhist teaching of equanimity, upekkha. It is not indifference, but steadiness, the capacity to remain open to each experience without clinging or rejecting. A heart in equanimity is not a numb heart. It is an awake heart, one that can weep without despair, laugh without attachment, love without possession. It does not grasp at spring, nor fight the arrival of winter. And so if tonight you find yourself in a season that feels cold, or barren, or unfamiliar, pause, not to escape it, but to be present with it. Ask it what it has come to teach. Perhaps it is asking you to rest, to go inward, to see that even now, even in this quiet, something is growing beneath the surface. Even when you feel disconnected, your roots are deepening. You are not the weather, you are the field, and the field is vast enough to hold every season. Breathe with that for a moment. Inhale slowly, gently. Feel the breath as a wind moving through the trees of your inner world. Some leaves remain, some have already fallen. Let it be, because the truth is, even longing changes, even clarity waxes and wanes. Rumi reminds us again and again to try to accept the changing seasons of your heart, not because change is easy, but because resisting it keeps us from seeing its beauty. There will be times when your inner world is bright and golden, and you feel in harmony with everything around you. And there will be times when everything seems to turn inward, and you wonder if the light will return. But just as the moon never truly disappears, your light does not vanish. It only shifts form. Sometimes it shines outward. Sometimes it glows softly within. Let that be enough for now. And as you rest here tonight, allow yourself to loosen your grip on whatever season you wish you were in. Trust that this one has something for you, even if it offers only stillness, or silence, or the slow return of breath. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are simply in a season. And so I leave you with a question as we continue this inward journey. What would change if you trusted the season you are in, not as punishment, but as part of your blooming? When you're ready, we'll move deeper into the melody beneath it all, the original song that your heart has always remembered. The original song before the world. There are longings that can't be traced to a memory. They arise not from a place you've been, nor from a face you've seen, but from something deeper, a pull toward something unnamed, yet intimately familiar. You may have felt it in a quiet moment, when the world paused just long enough for a strange ache to rise in your chest. An ache not for someone, not for something, but for a song you can't quite remember, though you're certain you've heard it before. Rumi once wrote, "We are all searching for the song we once heard before we were born." To the logical mind, this sounds like fantasy. How could we yearn for something that predates our own beginning? But the soul speaks a different language. It remembers things the intellect cannot grasp. It knows not with evidence, but with resonance. In Buddhism, this resonance is not unfamiliar. There is a teaching called Tathagata Garbha, sometimes translated as Buddha nature. It suggests that beneath all layers of confusion, suffering, and illusion, every being carries a seed of awakening, not something to be earned, but something remembered. You are not here to become what you are not. You are here to recall what you have always been. That forgotten song, Rumi's phrase for this inner truth, lives in your breath, in your silence, in the space between thoughts. It's the reason you can hear a piece of music and feel tears rise before your mind understands why. It's the reason a sunrise can make you pause, or why the scent of something familiar can bring a wave of feeling unanchored from any particular story. It's not nostalgia for the past. It's nostalgia for the before, for that ancient unity, that deep peace that existed before the world began making its demands. It's the sound of being before it became divided into names and roles and timelines. The song is still there, just beneath the noise. There is a Zen koan that asks, "What is your original face before your parents were born?" It is not meant to confuse. It is meant to point you toward the vastness of your being, not the body, not the mind, but the quiet witness beneath it all. The part of you that was never touched by praise or blame, gain or loss. The face that has always been singing, even as you forgot to listen. Rumi's poetry often dances with this paradox. He reminds us that what we desire most is not actually a person, or a place, or a specific outcome. It is the feeling behind those desires. It is the longing to return to something unbroken, whole, sacred. When he writes, "You think you desire a person, a place, a dream, but beneath them all, you are really yearning for that original song." He is stripping away the outer layers of our seeking and pointing us inward, again and again, toward that silent melody. From a philosophical perspective, some schools argue that longing is a sign of lack, that to desire is to admit incompleteness. But spiritual traditions, especially those influenced by mysticism and Buddhist insight, suggest something else, that longing, when deeply examined, is not about lack, but about fullness calling to itself. The desire for truth, for love, for peace, is the soul's memory of what is already true. It's as though you've always been hearing it faintly, like music playing just outside your reach. And yet, it is not outside, it is within. The journey is not outward, but inward, clearing away the noise that keeps you from hearing clearly. Buddhist practice often returns us to this principle through silence, not as an absence, but as a gateway. The breath becomes a mantra, the body becomes still, and in that stillness, something begins to hum, not with words, but with knowing. The knowing that you have never been lost, only distracted. The knowing that underneath all your seeking is a single, continuous note that has never stopped playing. In Rumi's world, that note is love, not sentimental, fleeting love, but the great love, the source of being itself. His mysticism doesn't separate life into sacred and profane. To him, the beloved is in everything. The song is not confined to temples or texts. It is in your laughter, in your tears, in the sound of footsteps on old wooden floors. To remember the song is to remember that the ordinary is holy. And yet remembering doesn't always come easily. Sometimes the world gets loud. Sometimes pain dulls the ear. Sometimes disappointment makes you doubt that there was ever music to begin with. But just as clouds can obscure the moon without erasing it, these moments do not cancel the truth. They only ask you to wait, to be still, to listen differently. And so tonight, if you feel tired or numb or far from yourself, don't worry. The song is still playing. It has never stopped. You may have been busy, or heartbroken, or simply distracted, but the melody has been faithful. It is patient. It waits for your attention, not with urgency, but with love. Close your eyes, if they haven't already closed. Feel your breath, not as a tool, but as a companion. It is singing too. Each inhale, each exhale, is part of the ancient rhythm. You are not just listening to the song, you are the song, you are the flute, and the breath moving through it. You are the silence between the notes. You are the listener and the music at once. Let that sink in, not just as a concept, but as a felt experience. You do not need to believe it. Just let yourself wonder if it could be true. Let that gentle curiosity soften your chest. Let it loosen whatever has become tight inside you. And now, as you rest in this quiet space, I leave you with a question that doesn't need an answer, only your presence. What would your life feel like if you stopped chasing songs outside you and began listening again to the one playing softly within? When you're ready, we'll continue toward the alchemy of pain and the luminous healing it already holds. Your pain will become your cure. There are nights when the weight of everything you've endured seems to press more deeply into your chest. A name you no longer speak, a season of life that ended too suddenly, a silence you didn't choose. Pain arrives not always as a scream, but often as a whisper, quiet, persistent, curling around the edges of your thoughts when the world grows still. Rumi, who knew the dark terrain of longing and separation, once wrote, "Don't get lost in your pain. Know that one day your pain will become your cure." At first, those words may sound like comfort, gentle encouragement to keep going, but look more closely and you'll see something more radical. He isn't saying your pain might lead to healing. He is saying the pain itself is the cure. The wound is not a detour from the path. It is the path. In Buddhism, this understanding is echoed in the first noble truth, dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately understood as a deep existential discomfort. The Buddha did not teach this as a hopeless observation, but as the beginning of wisdom. To acknowledge suffering without running from it is to begin the process of transformation. Not because the pain vanishes, but because our relationship to it changes. There is an old story told in the Buddhist tradition about a woman named Kisa Gautami. After losing her only child, she was overcome with grief and pleaded with the Buddha to bring her son back to life. Gently, the Buddha told her to find a mustard seed from a household that had never known sorrow. She searched from door to door, but at every home she found loss, heartbreak, or death. In time she returned, not with a seed, but with understanding. Her pain had not disappeared, but it had opened her eyes to the shared sorrow of all living beings. In that realization, the edge of her grief softened. Her pain became the doorway to compassion. Rumi's teachings are not so different. He doesn't glamorize suffering. He does not say pain is beautiful. But he insists that pain has purpose, that the soul, when wounded, becomes porous enough to receive light. The wound is the place where the light enters you. He tells us, that doesn't mean the wound is easy to bear, but it means it is not meaningless. In today's world, we are often encouraged to bypass pain, to stay positive, to distract, to fix. But what if the pain isn't asking to be fixed? What if it is asking to be seen, to be felt, to be honored? Rumi and the Dharma alike suggest that healing begins not with resistance, but with willingness to sit beside what hurts and listen. Not with judgment, but with reverence. From a psychological perspective, many scholars debate whether emotional pain should be managed or embraced. There are therapies designed to shift thought patterns, change behavior, reframe belief systems. These have their place. But deeper healing often requires something else, a kind of surrender, a sacred turning toward what we've tried for so long to escape, not to wallow but to witness. Because pain, when truly seen, often carries with it a hidden offering. There is a Zen parable about a student who came to his master, complaining of how much suffering he felt, how the pain of life seemed too heavy to bear. The master brought a glass of water and a handful of salt. He dropped the salt into the glass, stirred it, and asked the student to drink. "It's bitter," the student said. Then the master led him to a lake, dropped in another handful of salt, and told him to drink again. "It tastes like water," the student said. The master smiled. "Pain is the salt. Whether it tastes bitter or not depends on the container you place it in." Our hearts too can expand. They don't need to grow harder to carry pain. They need to grow wider. And often that widening is the very process we mistake for breaking. Rumi speaks to this directly when he writes, "Be ground, be crumbled so wildflowers will come up where you are." The ego resists this. It wants to stay intact. It fears the fall. But the soul knows that crumbling is not the end. It is the loosening of hard soil so that new life can emerge. You are not being ruined. You are being prepared. As you rest here tonight, perhaps some part of you still aches. A quiet loss, a regret, a sorrow that has stayed longer than you invited. And maybe you've asked yourself more than once why it hasn't gone away. But what if it's here because it's still working on you, still shaping you, still hollowing out space for something more honest, more whole, more alive? Not every pain becomes a poem. Not every wound will make sense. But all pain, when met with loving awareness, can become a gate, a place where the old self ends and something sacred begins. Take a slow breath now. Inhale deeply. Let it gather the tension in your body, and exhale softly. Let it go. Feel the pain not as an enemy, but as part of the weather within you, a passing cloud, a cold breeze, an echo. Nothing in you is wrong. Nothing is broken beyond healing. And as you drift further into stillness, I leave you with this question, not to answer tonight, but to carry gently into the quiet. If your pain truly held the cure, how would you treat it differently? When you're ready, we'll journey further toward the shedding, the surrender, and the letting go that pain quietly prepares us for. Let the dead leaves drop. There comes a moment in every season when the tree must begin to let go, not because it is failing, but because it is wise. The leaves, once bright with life, begin to turn. Their beauty shifts, the color fades, and then quietly they release. One by one, they fall to the earth, not with regret, but with grace. The tree does not cling. It knows the rhythm. It trusts the cycle. Rumi, with his endless understanding of this natural surrender, once wrote, "Be like a tree and let the dead leaves drop." To let go is often described as a spiritual act, but in reality, it is also deeply human and deeply challenging. We hold on to things not because they nourish us, but because they are familiar. We cling to identities, beliefs, relationships, and stories that once gave us comfort, but have long since stopped growing. And even when they begin to wither, we grip tighter, hoping to keep them alive. Letting go feels like loss, but sometimes loss is the beginning of lightness. In Buddhist teaching, the concept of non-attachment, upadana, is not about indifference or cold detachment. It's about loosening our grasp on what no longer serves the unfolding of our inner life. It is the wisdom of release, of trusting that what is real will remain, and what is meant to go will not leave us empty, but spacious. Rumi's image of the tree is not random. The tree doesn't mourn its fallen leaves. It doesn't judge the changing colors. It simply participates in the rhythm of letting go, and in doing so, it prepares for renewal. It clears the way for what comes next, not by force but by yielding. There is a story from Zen that speaks to this quietly powerful process. A traveler seeks shelter from a sudden storm and stumbles upon a small hut. An old monk invites him in. As they sit by the fire, the traveler notices how empty the hut is. No decorations, no possessions, only essentials. He asks the monk, "Where are all your things?" The monk replies, "Where are yours?" The traveler laughs and says, "I'm just passing through." The monk smiles and says, "So am I." That is the heart of the teaching. We are all just passing through, and yet we accumulate objects, emotions, opinions, expectations, until our souls grow heavy with what we cannot carry. Letting go is not an act of abandonment. It is an act of wisdom, of knowing that we cannot walk far with arms full of what should have been set down long ago. Philosophers and psychologists alike have long debated the nature of identity, whether we are shaped by what we acquire or by what we relinquish. Western psychology often emphasizes building the self, constructing a strong identity. Eastern thought, especially within Buddhist and Sufi traditions, tends to focus on dissolution, melting away the false to uncover what has always been true. Rumi, in his depth, reminds us that to find the beloved, you must wash yourself of yourself. It is not destruction, it is return. The ego clings to leaves because it believes they define the tree. But the soul knows better. The soul remembers that it was never meant to be decorated, it was meant to be rooted and free. And so, what are the leaves in your life that are ready to fall? Perhaps it is a belief you've outgrown, a self-image that no longer fits, a relationship that echoes with more silence than joy. Perhaps it is the constant striving to be more, do more, prove more. Letting go does not mean failure. It means you have recognized the weight of what you no longer need. There is peace in release, a quiet power, like the hush that falls after the final leaf drifts to the ground. The tree does not hurry the process. It allows the wind to do its work. In the same way, you do not have to force your becoming. You only need to stop resisting the fall of what is already fading. Take a breath with me now. Inhale gently and exhale slowly. Let your body soften. Let your shoulders release some of the burden they have been silently holding. You are allowed to let go of what hurt you, of what no longer fits, of the roles you thought you had to play. Each exhale can be a letting go, each breath a small surrender. In Rumi's vision, love is not about possession, it is about presence, and presence requires space. When we are too full of yesterday, there is no room for what might arrive today. When our hearts are cluttered with the stories we no longer believe, the truth has no place to land. Letting go is not emptiness, it is readiness. The tree does not drop its leaves because it is dying. It drops them because it is alive, because it is preparing for rest, because it knows that life requires pauses and that growth is not always upward or visible. Sometimes growth is invisible, underground, quiet. So tonight, as you rest here, perhaps you might gently ask yourself, not with pressure, but with curiosity, what are the leaves you've been carrying out of habit, not necessity? What stories are you still telling yourself that no longer bring you peace? And what might begin to grow if you made space? You don't have to decide now. Let the questions settle beside you. Let them be your companions in the quiet hours ahead. And I leave you with this simple, tender inquiry. If you trusted that letting go would not leave you empty, but open, what would you release tonight? When you're ready, we'll continue toward the paradox of release, the quiet melting of ego, and the widening path toward truth. Wash yourself of yourself. There is a line in Rumi's writing that feels like a whisper from the soul's deepest center. Be like melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. It is not a command to disappear, nor an invitation to denial. It is a call to dissolve, gracefully, naturally, like snow under spring sunlight, into something truer than the identity we so often mistake for who we are. At first, this may sound confusing. How can one live and yet shed the very idea of oneself? How do you move through the world without a firm sense of identity? But the wisdom here is not about erasing yourself into blankness. It's about remembering what is beneath the surface you've spent so long polishing. We spend years, sometimes decades, building the idea of who we think we are. We give it a name, a profession, preferences, titles, stories of triumph, and stories of failure. We wear this identity like a garment, layering it with the expectations of others and the survival strategies of our past. And while some of these layers serve us for a time, eventually they grow heavy. They restrict the breath. They conceal more than they protect. In Buddhist philosophy, the concept of anatta, no self, is not a nihilistic declaration. It is a liberating insight. It reveals that what we call self is not a single fixed thing, but a constantly shifting constellation of conditions. Your thoughts, your emotions, your body, your memories, they arise and pass, like weather. You are not a possession, you are a process. Rumi echoes this realization in poetic form. To wash yourself of yourself means to release the illusion that you are the sum total of your image, your reputation, or your mental narratives. It means to soften into your essence, into the part of you that was never born and will never die. The part of you that watches quietly behind your eyes, that does not rise and fall with moods or outcomes. This witnessing presence is not defined by anything, and therefore it is free. In Zen, There is a story of a young monk who was obsessively trying to achieve enlightenment. He meditated longer than the others, fasted more strictly, and questioned every thought he had. One day, his teacher told him to take a walk through the snowy forest. As he walked, the snow began to melt under the warming sun, dripping from the branches above and soaking his robe. Frustrated, cold and confused, he returned and said, "I found nothing out there but wet clothes." The teacher simply nodded. Exactly, that is the teaching. The snow melts. Nothing is added. Nothing is missing. This story is not about resignation, it is about realization. Enlightenment is not something added to you. It is the melting away of what is not you. The layers that obscure the truth are not permanent. They fall away naturally when you stop trying to control them, when you stop gripping them as if they define your worth. But ego resists this softening. It fears irrelevance. It is loud and protective, convincing us that without it, we will be exposed or invisible. Yet strangely, it is only when we release this false armor that others can truly see us, not the mask, but the person behind it. Vulnerability becomes clarity. Simplicity becomes strength. Rumi understood this deeply. He wasn't advocating for passivity or detachment from life. On the contrary, his poetry is full of passion, of longing, of ecstatic surrender. But it is the surrender of illusion, not the abandonment of joy. When you wash yourself of yourself, you are not disappearing, you are reappearing, you are not erasing, you are revealing. And perhaps you felt this in small and unexpected ways. In moments when you forgot to be impressive and ended up being fully present. When you stopped performing and for a breathless instant simply were. These moments are not rare because they're impossible. They're rare because we are trained to hide from them, but they are always available. They are always waiting just beyond the ego's grip. From a philosophical standpoint, identity is often framed as necessary for meaning, but spiritual traditions challenge this notion. They suggest that clinging to identity as fixed and central is precisely what keeps us from intimacy with ourselves, with others, with the sacred. They invite us to live not from the story of who we are, but from the mystery of being itself. As you lie here tonight, perhaps you've been carrying the weight of a name that no longer feels true, or the pressure to live up to an idea of yourself that leaves you tired, hollow, or disconnected. Perhaps the version of you that once made sense now feels too tight, like a skin you've outgrown but haven't yet shed. You don't need to tear it away, you only need to melt. Gently, patiently, like snow beneath a soft sun. Take a breath now, let it flow in with ease and out with release. Feel the gentle rhythm of your body, reminding you that you are already enough, without effort. You do not need to add anything tonight. You are not here to fix yourself. You are here to remember yourself. The one who lives beneath the layers. The one who does not need to be named, to be real. And so, let this evening be a quiet washing. Let it rinse away the residue of other people's expectations, the stale roles you've been playing, the stories that no longer nourish your becoming. Let it all dissolve, not as abandonment, but as return. And now, as the stillness begins to settle more deeply around you, I leave you with this question. If the self you've been carrying is not the truth of who you are, who might you become if you allowed yourself to melt? When you're ready, we'll continue toward the great call of belonging, the invitation that welcomes all wanderers home. Come, come, whoever you are. There is a line simple, ancient, and so tender it seems to lean forward and take your hand. Rumi writes, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. At first glance, it reads like an invitation, but linger with it long enough, and you'll see it for what it really is, a homecoming. In our lives, we often wait to feel worthy before we enter sacred spaces. We think we must be healed before we're welcome, calm before we're spiritual, certain before we're allowed to belong. But the great spiritual traditions, Buddhism included, tell a different story. They tell us that the path begins exactly where we are, not where we pretend to be. And Rumi, in his soft but unwavering voice, agrees. Whoever you are, however tangled your thoughts, however far you've drifted, come anyway. The Buddha himself welcomed all who came seeking refuge, whether kings or outcasts, scholars or beggars. He did not ask for resumes of purity. He only asked for sincerity, for willingness, for presence. In this way, the Dharma gate is always open, not to the perfect, but to the ready. There is a Zen story about a young monk who felt ashamed of his doubts. He confessed to his teacher, "Sometimes, I'm not sure I even believe in this path." The teacher nodded gently and replied, "Even that is a path." The truth, in Zen and in life, is that the journey does not require unwavering faith. It only asks that you keep walking, even if you falter, even if your steps are small, even if you stop and cry. The journey continues as long as you don't turn away from yourself. Rumi's line, "lover of leaving," is particularly profound. He doesn't condemn the one who drifts, he includes them. He welcomes those who run from devotion, who get lost in longing, who leave again and again, because he knows the human heart is not linear. It opens and closes, it draws near and pulls away. But he also knows that even the ones who wander are part of the sacred circle. In Buddhist psychology, the mind is described as a monkey, restless, leaping from thought to thought. We are not judged for this. We are invited to observe it, to return to breath, to return to now. Each return, however brief, is a homecoming. Each moment of mindfulness is an act of belonging. You don't need to silence the monkey mind. You only need to witness it with compassion. The spiritual path, then, is not a straight road but a spiral. You circle around your pain, your desires, your stories. You revisit old doubts, old dreams, and each time you see them more clearly. Each time you meet yourself more gently. What once felt like failure begins to feel like rhythm. Philosophers have long debated whether belonging is something we earn or something innate. Is it granted only after proving ourselves, or does it arise from being alive at all? The mystics, Rumi among them, settle this debate by stepping outside of it entirely. To them, belonging is not conditional. It is intrinsic. It is your birthright. You belong not because of what you've done, but because you are. And yet, how many of us live as though we are strangers to our own lives? How often do we shrink ourselves, mute our needs, or stay on the edges, hoping perhaps that if we are quiet enough, we'll be allowed in? But what if the door was never locked? What if the only thing that needed to open was your own heart? There is a beautiful teaching in the Buddhist tradition known as metta, loving kindness. It begins with the self. May I be happy, may I be safe, may I be well, not because you've earned it, but because everyone deserves it. From there, it extends outward to friends, strangers, even to those you find difficult. It teaches us that love does not need to be deserved. It only needs to be remembered. Rumi's words do this. They remember for us when we forget. They remind us that the sacred does not flinch at our doubts or judge our imperfections. It draws near. It waits at the threshold with a lantern in hand, whispering gently, "Come anyway." So tonight, if you feel like the one who has left too many times, or doubted too often, or stayed away too long, Know this, the caravan is still moving, and there is space for you. You do not need to be fixed before you are welcome. You only need to return. And returning doesn't require a map. It begins here, with your breath, with the quiet beating of your heart, with the willingness to sit still and feel your own presence again. Take a breath with me now. Slowly inhale and exhale. Let that be your first step back. Let it be enough. There is nothing outside of you that needs to be changed before you are allowed to feel at home in your own life. The journey is not about arrival. It is about remembering, again and again, that you are already part of the whole. As you settle deeper into this night, I leave you with a question that only your heart can answer. What might happen if you believed you were already welcome, exactly as you are, exactly where you are? When you're ready, we'll continue into the fire that refines, into the love that burns away everything false, until only truth remains. The fire that burns the false self. There is a fire that does not destroy, but purifies. It does not consume the essence of who you are. It burns away everything that is not you. Rumi knew this fire well. He did not speak of love as a gentle comfort or a poetic indulgence. He called it what it is, a force of transformation. Set your life on fire, he said. Seek those who fan your flames. It is not a metaphor to be admired. It is a truth to be lived. We often speak of love as soft, sweet, and safe, but the kind of love that Rumi describes, the love that awakens the soul, is anything but safe. It is not here to preserve your comforts or guard your ego. It arrives uninvited, and it begins to undo you. It asks you to surrender your masks, to lay down your pride, to release your need for certainty. It will burn through the stories you tell to make yourself feel worthy. And in the ashes, it will leave only what was ever real. In Buddhist practice, this burning is mirrored in the process of vipassana, insight meditation. The practitioner sits not to escape suffering, but to see it clearly. With calm attention, they turn inward and allow the fire of awareness to reveal every layer of delusion, craving, and aversion. What is revealed is not always pleasant, but it is necessary. Because clarity is not born in comfort. It emerges from courage, the courage to face the heat. There is a Zen tale of a disciple who asked his master, "What is the path to enlightenment?" The master responded by pointing to the hearth and saying, "Throw yourself in the fire." The student was startled. "Won't that kill me?" "Only the part of you that is not real," the master replied. "The fire is not literal. It is the heat of truth. And yes, it is intense. But it is also deeply merciful. It burns away the false self so that the soul can finally breathe. The false self is not evil. It is simply mistaken. It is the part of us that believes we must earn love by performing, that we must prove our worth through perfection or control. It is the voice that compares, that competes, that hides. It is the fear that if people saw who we truly were, we would be left behind. But the truth, as Rumi and the Dharma remind us, is that we are already whole. We do not need to become worthy. We need to remember. And remembering in its deepest form is rarely peaceful at first. It often begins with disruption, with fire, with the collapse of something you once thought you needed, an identity, a belief, a relationship, a dream. The false self interprets this as tragedy, but the soul knows it as release. From a philosophical perspective, the process of identity dissolution has long been seen as dangerous or destabilizing. In many Western traditions, the self is viewed as central, the seat of reason, morality, and agency. But in mystical and Buddhist thought, the self is seen not as the center, but as the veil. And it is precisely in its unmaking that one finds freedom. To lose the false self is not to lose your life. It is to begin living it, not from fear but from essence, not from story but from truth. In Rumi's words, try to accept the changing seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons passing over your fields. The fire is one of those seasons, and though it burns, it also clears. Have you ever noticed how some of your most painful moments led to your deepest clarity? How something you thought would destroy you instead opened you? This is the paradox of transformation. It looks like loss, but it becomes liberation. The fire does not take what is real, it reveals it. And so, as you rest here tonight, if you are standing in the middle of something burning, if something in your life is dissolving or no longer fits, know that you are not alone. This is the sacred undoing, the necessary unraveling, not a punishment, but a passage. What feels like falling apart may actually be falling in. You don't have to understand the whole process. You don't have to rush it. Fire works in its own time. It burns what is ready. It spares what is not. Your task is only to remain present, to breathe, to trust. Inhale deeply and exhale slowly. Imagine your breath fanning the flame of truth, not with panic, but with quiet permission. You are not feeding destruction, you are feeding transformation, and as the heat reveals what is no longer needed, you may begin to feel something surprising: relief, lightness, even gratitude. For what is more exhausting than pretending to be something you're not? Let the old roles fall. Let the expectations dissolve. Let the lies you've told yourself about your worth burn away. You do not need them anymore. You never did. And as you soften into this space, I leave you with this question. If you stop trying to protect the self you've outgrown, what might the fire of truth begin to reveal? When you're ready, we'll step into the circle beyond time, where love is not a memory or a promise, but the very atmosphere we live in. The circle of love beyond time, somewhere beyond the ticking of clocks and the forward march of days, there is a space where love is not bound by beginnings or endings, a space where what once was is never truly lost, and what is yet to come has already touched your soul in quiet ways. Rumi points us toward this sacred dimension when he writes, "Lovers don't finally meet somewhere, they're in each other all along." It is not a line about fate. It is a truth about timeless connection. In the world of form, we measure love in minutes and milestones. We count anniversaries, remember first glances, and grieve final goodbyes. But beneath the surface of time-bound experience, there is a deeper current, a circle, not a line. In this circle, love is not something you find. It is something you return to again and again until you remember that it never left. Buddhist wisdom echoes this beautifully. It speaks of interbeing, the profound truth that all things are connected, not just in theory, but in breath, in essence, in nature. You are not separate from those you love. You are not even separate from those you've lost. Their presence, like yours, is woven into the fabric of what is. They may no longer speak your name aloud, but they move in the wind that stirs your memory, the song that makes your chest ache, the silence that feels unexpectedly full. And so when Rumi speaks of lovers being in each other all along, he is not being sentimental, he is being honest. The people we love become part of us, not because we possess them, but because love, when true, dissolves boundaries. It rearranges the architecture of the soul. It leaves its trace not as a mark of ownership, but as an opening. Time may tell you that someone is gone, but love does not obey time. Love whispers, feel again, listen again, trust again. And if you do, if you sit long enough with the silence, you may notice that what you thought was absence is actually presence in a softer form. There is a Zen story of a monk who spent years grieving the loss of his teacher. He wandered from temple to temple, unable to find peace. One night, he sat alone in a forest clearing and said aloud, "I miss you." And then, for the first time in years, he was quiet enough to hear the wind pass through the trees, gentle but steady. It was not the teacher's voice, but something deeper, a knowing, a warmth, a presence that was never truly elsewhere. The Buddhist view of time is not linear. It is cyclical. Just as the seasons return, just as breath rises and falls, just as the moon disappears and returns, so too does the essence of connection. What you have loved, you have not lost. It has only changed shape. Philosophers often argue about whether love is a subjective emotion or an objective truth. But mystics don't argue. They experience, and their experience tells them this: love is not something you generate. It is something you remember. It is the ground beneath your fear, the sky above your doubt, the space within your longing. We are often told to move on from love that has ended, to close chapters, to seek closure. But what if some love is not meant to be closed? What if it's meant to be carried, not as grief, but as sacred inheritance? What if the heart is not a vault, but a circle? And in that circle, nothing real is ever gone. Rumi's circle is not bound by flesh or form. It is not diminished by distance. He invites us to step beyond the calendar, beyond the roles we once played, and feel the presence of love as it truly is, spacious, enduring, and free. And so if tonight you are thinking of someone you once loved, someone who walked beside you through laughter or through sorrow, know this: the circle is still intact. Their name still lives quietly inside you. Their voice still echoes in some unlit hallway of your heart. And no matter how much time has passed, they are not far. This is not a call to hold on in pain. It is a call to soften into the mystery, to allow love to be less about possession and more about connection, less about memory and more about presence. Because love in its highest form is not about holding, it is about being held. Take a breath now, gently, feel it move in and flow out. Let this breath be part of the circle. You are not outside of it, you are within it. With every inhale you remember, with every exhale you return. In this place, there is no need to chase or cling. Love is not going anywhere. It is the stillness beneath your restlessness. It is the warmth beneath your questions. It is the reason the heart keeps beating long after goodbye. And so, as you rest here tonight, I leave you with this quiet invitation, not as an answer, but as a turning inward. What if the love you thought you had lost has been walking with you all along, just in a quieter form? When you're ready, we'll journey further into the deep silence that speaks louder than words, where the voice of the divine still echoes, even when everything else fades. The silence where God speaks. There is a kind of silence that is not empty, but full, not the silence of absence or disconnection, but the rich, expansive stillness in which something deeper is finally allowed to speak. Rumi knew this silence well. He once wrote, "Listen to the silence. It has so much to say." And though many search for God in books, in rituals, or in the noise of answers, Rumi reminds us that the truest meeting often happens where words fall away. In the modern world, silence can feel foreign. It is often filled quickly, with voices, with screens, with thoughts rushing in to occupy the space. But spiritual traditions across time and culture have pointed to this stillness as sacred. In Buddhism, silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is a portal into clarity. The practice of noble silence, observed by monks and lay practitioners alike, is not an escape from life, but a return to it. Without the chatter, without the performance, the truth of things begins to reveal itself, gently, unmistakably. We are conditioned to associate meaning with articulation, to feel safe when things are spoken and named. But what if the deepest truths do not arrive through speech? What if the divine, the eternal, the vast does not shout, but waits patiently in the quiet corners of your awareness until you are still enough to hear? There is a Zen saying, when the mouth is closed, the mind begins to listen. In this stillness we become available, not to more thoughts or distractions, but to that quiet inner presence that has always been there. The part of us that does not argue or prove, it simply knows. Rumi described this presence as a kind of music that plays beneath the surface of all things. He did not mean literal sound, but something subtler, a resonance in the bones, a harmony in the heart. He said, "There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen, it is not a metaphor. It is an invitation. And this voice, it does not come when summoned with force. It arrives when we soften, when we are no longer striving to hear it, when we are no longer needing it to sound a certain way. It is a whisper woven into your breath, a current that moves just beneath awareness, not loud, not urgent, but endlessly faithful." In Buddhist meditation, silence is not a passive state, it is active listening. To sit in silence is to listen, not just to what is pleasant, but to everything, to the fear beneath the thought, to the memory beneath the emotion, to the still space beneath the breath. And over time something shifts. What was once merely quiet becomes presence, and presence, when sustained, becomes sacred. Philosophers have long asked whether the divine is accessible through language, or if it lives beyond the reach of reason and words. The mystics again bypass this debate entirely. They tell us, go quiet, let go of the need to define or categorize. Meet God, not in concept, but in experience. Because in silence, there is no doctrine, there is no right or wrong, there is only this moment, unfolding without resistance. And sometimes, that is where the deepest healing occurs, not through analysis or explanation, but through deep, wordless being. Have you ever noticed how certain moments stop you, not with noise, but with quiet? A full moon rising over water, the hush after snowfall, the soft breath of someone you love sleeping beside you. In those moments, your mind doesn't have much to say, because something older, something deeper, is speaking, and it needs no words. Rumi teaches that silence is not the end of conversation. It is the place where true conversation begins, where we stop talking at life and start listening to it, where we stop asking for signs and realize the whole sky has been answering us all along. So if tonight your mind feels tired of figuring everything out, if your thoughts are looping or your heart is restless, maybe it's not more answers you need, maybe it's less noise, maybe the clarity you're looking for is already here, waiting behind the next quiet breath. Take one with me now. Inhale softly and exhale even more gently. Feel how the breath creates a space, not a void, but a presence. You are not alone in this silence. You are being met, not with thunder, but with peace. And if your silence feels heavy at first, if it brings with it old grief or unnamed sorrow, let that be part of the conversation. Silence is not absence, it holds everything. It is large enough for pain and joy to sit side by side. It is spacious enough to hold all your questions without forcing an answer. So often, we think we need to fill the silence with something beautiful. But what if silence is already beautiful? What if it is not a blank page, but a sacred text written in breath and stillness? Tonight, you don't need to solve anything. You don't need to name what you feel. You don't even need to be certain of where you are going. You only need to be here and quiet.
Let the silence speak. Let it fill the space between thoughts. Let it remind you of the part of you that has never been afraid, because it has never needed to explain. And as you rest here, let me offer this final reflection, not to stir the mind, but to steady it. If you stopped asking silence for answers, what might it begin to reveal? When you're ready, we'll step into the rhythm of the turning world, into the dance that began before time and continues even now within your breath.
We come spinning out of nothingness. There is a line of Rumi's that dances at the edge of logic and leaps into something wider, older, more mysterious. We come spinning out of nothingness, scattering stars like dust. It is a vision of origin that defies linear thinking. It doesn't say we are born into the world. It says we emerge not from a place, but from a vast, silent source, more spacious than sky, more invisible than breath. We arise not as accidents or products, but as expressions, movements of a divine rhythm we cannot name but can sometimes feel. In modern life, we are taught to think in straight lines, to seek cause and effect, to pin beginnings to dates and identities. But the mystics remind us that true beginnings are not so easily marked. You were not born the day your body arrived. You began long before that. You began in longing, in movement, in stillness. You are not simply made of blood and bone. You are composed of wonder too. Rumi understood this at a depth most cannot articulate. He did not see the self as static or singular. To him we were whirlwinds of presence, always becoming, always turning. The Sufi dervishes he inspired spin not to perform but to remember. Their whirling is not a show, it is a prayer, a reenactment of our birth from mystery, a return to the truth that we are not just observers of the divine, we are made of it. In Buddhism, the idea of shunyata, emptiness, is not a nihilistic void, it is spacious potential. It is the fertile nothing from which everything arises. It is the field of awareness before it crystallizes into form. And in that space there is no self, no other, only movement, only flow, only this great, spinning unfolding. We tend to be frightened of nothingness. We associate it with absence, loss, or death. But the mystic traditions, Buddhist and Sufi alike, reframe it as origin, as truth. You are not separate from the nothingness. You are it, dancing in temporary form. You are what happens when the vastness decides to express itself for a while. You are a shape, taken by the formless. A song sung once, never the same again. There's a story in Zen about a monk who asked his teacher, "What is my original face before my parents were born?" It's not a riddle meant to be solved. It's an opening, a crack in the rigid identity we build. Because who you are cannot be fully captured by your name, your history, your thoughts, or even your choices. You are more than the visible. You are the spinning. Rumi writes about this with the fluidity of someone who has seen it from within. To him, we are not people chasing meaning. We are meaning in motion. Each of us carries the cosmos in our chest, not metaphorically, but literally. Your body is made of stardust. Your breath is borrowed from trees. Your mind is ancient. You are not separate from anything. You are the universe noticing itself. And yet we forget. We shrink into roles, timelines, labels. We say, I am this, or I am not that. And we forget the spaciousness from which we arose. We stop spinning. We get stuck. We forget that life is not a straight path. It is a turning. It is a dance. Philosophers and scientists have tried to define consciousness for centuries. Is it matter? Is it energy? Is it emergent or fundamental? But perhaps consciousness is not meant to be dissected. Perhaps it is meant to be entered, lived, trusted, like a rhythm you do not understand, but cannot help moving to. Rumi's dance is an invitation to participate, not to explain. It says, don't wait to feel certain. Don't wait to feel ready. Begin spinning now. Not outwardly, but inwardly. Begin to turn your awareness back toward the spacious core, not to escape life, but to remember its origin. If you close your eyes now and breathe, you might begin to sense it, not as a thought, but as a sensation, the quiet turning within, the breath that follows its own rhythm, the stillness at the center of the spin. You do not have to name it, just feel it. Inhale and exhale. Let yourself settle into the mystery that you don't need to solve. You are not a puzzle, you are not a project, you are a movement, a wave, a turn. Nothing in you needs to be fixed, to be beautiful. Nothing in you needs to be known to be whole. Let the identity you've been clinging to soften. Let the certainty fall away. Let yourself spin, not into chaos, but into presence. Into the remembrance that you are not here to control life. You are here to dance with it. And as the stillness deepens around you, know this: you are not apart from the vastness. You are the vastness taking form for a moment in time, dancing in a human shape, loving with a human heart. You are not alone. You are not small. You are not separate. You are what happens when the sacred becomes curious. You are the turn. You are the breath between beginnings. You are the silence becoming song. And so I leave you with this quiet, spacious question. If you stopped seeing yourself as a thing, and began seeing yourself as a rhythm, what might you begin to feel again? When you're ready, we'll complete this circle back to the heart of longing, to the place where the soul remembers why it came, and what it always knew. Don't go back to sleep. There is a moment, often just before waking or just after a revelation, when the world feels slightly more alive. The air holds a certain shimmer, the silence a kind of meaning, and for a brief breath you remember something older than language, something true. It is in this delicate space that Rumi's voice calls across time. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. This isn't a warning against physical sleep. It is an urging against forgetting, against drifting back into the dull routine of unconscious living. The kind of sleep Rumi speaks of is the sleep of the soul, the slumber of one who has stopped listening inwardly, who has become numb to the miracle of being alive. His words are a bell rung softly at the edge of dreaming, a reminder that awareness is not a task but a blessing, that to be awake, truly awake, is not to be flooded with noise, but to feel life vibrating gently under your skin. In Buddhism, this state is known as sati, mindfulness, not as a discipline or a moral command, but as a natural clarity, an inner wakefulness that arises when the mind is no longer clouded by craving or fear. The Buddha's final instruction before his passing was simple: all compounded things are subject to decay. Strive on with heedfulness. He did not say strive with anxiety. He said heedfulness, a kind of tender, attentive living, a wakefulness that doesn't rush, but also doesn't drift. To be awake is not to be constantly stimulated. It is to be responsive. It is to notice the small moments where grace enters unnoticed. It is to hear the wind in the trees and understand that this too is a kind of teaching. To watch a tear fall, not with judgment, but with reverence. It is to greet each moment as if it has something to offer, because it does. Even the ones that hurt, especially the ones that hurt. Rumi says, "Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open?" This prison he speaks of is not made of steel. It is made of habit, of fear, of repetition. We live behind the bars of what we think we already know about the world, about others, about ourselves. But wakefulness is a key. It unlocks us, not by giving us new answers, but by revealing that the questions were always pointing inward. There's a Zen story of a student who asked, "What is enlightenment?" The teacher responded, "When hungry, eat; when tired, sleep." The student was confused. "Isn't that what we all do?" The teacher shook his head gently. "No. When others eat, they think of 100 things. When they sleep, they dream of tomorrow. I eat, and nothing else. I sleep, and nothing else." That is the difference. To be awake is not to be extraordinary. It is to be present. But presence is not always comfortable. In fact, the first stages of wakefulness can be quite painful, because to open your eyes is to see what you've been avoiding. It's to feel what you've been numbing. It's to admit truths you've politely silenced. Yet this is precisely why Rumi pleads, don't go back to sleep, because once you've seen clearly, even for a moment, you've already begun to heal. You might ask, but how do I stay awake in a world that feels so heavy? The answer is not to carry everything. It is to touch each moment lightly but fully, to breathe into the tension without trying to fix it all, to offer kindness where you can, and silence where words would only tangle. You do not have to hold the whole world. You only have to be awake enough to hold your place in it, with care, with clarity, with humility. Wakefulness is not perfection. It is intimacy with yourself, with the seasons of your mind, with the impermanence of everything around you. To be awake is to bow, again and again, to the truth that everything changes and nothing can be grasped for long. Not youth, not certainty, not even love in its forms. But what remains is this presence, this breath, this noticing. And so as this night deepens, I invite you not into sleep, but into sacred rest. A rest that does not abandon awareness, but cradles it. A rest that does not close the eyes to life, but lets them soften into acceptance. There is nothing you need to solve right now, nothing you need to force. Just let your body soften into the surface beneath you. Let your breath remind you, you are still here, you are still listening, you are still becoming. Rumi's words are not an ending, they are a beginning. They ask us to rise gently each day, not with urgency but with reverence, to walk into the ordinary with sacred eyes, to hear the wind and feel it say, "Wake up, beloved, the world is alive with you." And so I leave you with this final question, not to stir thought, but to seed it in the soil of your heart. Now that you've tasted even one drop of wakefulness, what part of you no longer wishes to go back to sleep? Rest now, not in forgetting, but in remembering. Let the breeze at dawn greet you when it comes. You'll know it when it arrives, soft, familiar, full of secrets. And in that moment, you'll understand what Rumi meant all along. You have not been walking toward the sacred. You are the sacred, waking up to itself.